I sat at the kitchen table, twisting a crumpled napkin between my fingers, staring at the letter Ted had left for me. My eyes skimmed over the neatly typed words, but I couldn't bring myself to read them again. Once had been enough. Laura, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. I won't apologize, because I don't regret it. Her name is Selena Blake. You'll hear about her soon enough. She owns Blake LUX. She's everything you're not. Sophisticated, ambitious, and she actually knows how to support a man. I'm moving in with her. I've already started the process of dissolving our marriage. Consider this letter a courtesy. Ted. My grip tightened around the napkin, my nails digging into my palm. A courtesy. That's what he called this. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a final slap in the face, as if he was tossing me out of his life like an old receipt. I wanted to be shocked. I wanted to be heartbroken. But the truth was, I had been expecting something like this for a long time. Our marriage had been unraveling for years, slowly, painfully, like a thread coming loose one fiber at a time. At first, it was just the small things, the way he stopped laughing at my jokes, the way I stopped waiting up for him at night. Then came the fights, the icy silences, the resentment that festered between us like an open wound. He hated my bluntness, my unwillingness to play the role of the doting, obedient wife. I hated the way he dismissed me, like my existence was nothing more than an inconvenience he had to tolerate. I had tried to care. I really had. But eventually, I stopped fighting for something that had already bled out. And now, here it was, the inevitable conclusion. But for all the ways I had imagined our marriage ending, I hadn't pictured this, a cold, impersonal letter, signed off as if he were canceling a gym membership. I glanced at the empty space on the counter where his coffee mug used to sit, the faint indentation on the couch where he'd lounged every night, scrolling through his phone instead of talking to me. Good riddance, I wanted to think. But the anger inside me was too sharp, too consuming to be dismissed that easily. What made it worse, what really made my blood boil, was Selena Blake. I knew her name. Everyone in the city did. She was the new face of luxury hotels, the young, ambitious owner of the Blake LUX empire. Elegant, poised, the kind of woman men fell over themselves to impress. And Ted, who had spent our entire marriage complaining about my attitude, about how I wasn't graceful enough, polished enough, thought he had won some kind of prize. I almost laughed. He thought he was trading up. Thought he was leaving behind a woman who held him back for a life of wealth, power, and sophistication. But Ted didn't know who he was dealing with. I let out a slow breath, trying to ground myself, my eyes falling on the old wooden dresser in the corner of the living room. It had once belonged to my grandfather, a man who had believed in always thinking 5 steps ahead. For years, I had told myself I would go through it, clear out the old papers, maybe donate some of his things. But something always held me back. Tonight, though, something felt different. Moving on instinct, I walked toward the dresser, my hands steady as I pulled open the heavy drawers. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air as I sifted through forgotten relics, old receipts, faded postcards, a cigar box with a rusted latch. Then, beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, I found it. An old leather folder. It was thick, heavy, the kind of thing that carried weight, not just physically, but historically. Something important. My heart pounded as I flipped it open. Inside, the pages were crisp, carefully preserved. Contracts, deeds, financial statements. Some were old, dating back decades, but others were recent. And they all bore the same name. My grandfather's. I frowned, flipping through them, my mind racing. I had always thought of him as just a small-time motel owner, a man who had worked hard to build something decent for his family. But these weren't small-time investments. These were major properties, stakes in some of the most profitable hotels on the East Coast. My breath caught as I reached the final pages. And then I saw it. Blake Lux. I froze. My eyes traced the letters again, as if they might shift and change before me, as if I were imagining things. But I wasn't. Several of the properties listed under my grandfather's name were directly connected to Selena Blake's company. I flipped back to the financial statements, reading them more carefully now, my mind moving at lightning speed. For years, my grandfather had quietly built a fortune, not just through his own motels, but through strategic investments in high-end resorts, always staying just beneath the radar. And when he died, everything had passed to me. My father had never cared for the business side of things, had let the management fall to a trust. And I had never bothered to dig into the details. Until now. Until tonight. Until my cheating husband left me for a woman who unknowingly owed part of her success to my family's investments. A slow smile spread across my lips. Ted thought he had won. Thought he had escaped me. Thought he had traded me in for something better. But the joke was on him. Because what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that his new, perfect life rested entirely in my hands. And I had no intention of letting him live happily ever after. Not when he had given me the perfect opportunity to destroy him. I barely slept that night. The weight of the discovery sat heavy in my chest, adrenaline coursing through me like fire. I spent hours at the kitchen table, surrounded by my grandfather's documents, poring over every page, every signature, every financial statement. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. My grandfather had been a far wealthier man than anyone had ever known. While everyone, including my own father, believed he had been just a modest motel owner, the truth was far more astonishing. He had quietly built an empire. A network of investments that had grown into a silent but powerful force in the hotel industry. And somehow no one had ever realized it. Because he never flaunted it. Never changed his way of life. Instead, he had operated through intermediaries, shell companies, and trusted associates, keeping his ownership hidden from public view. He had made calculated moves, always staying ahead of the market, always knowing exactly when to buy in and when to pull out. And now, years after his death, everything had passed to me. The documents in front of me confirmed it. I held majority shares in several high-end resorts, all of them quietly generating revenue under the management of a financial trust. And among those properties, several owned by Blake Lux. My pulse pounded in my ears as I flipped through the statements again. Ted, in all his arrogance, had no idea that the woman he had left me for, the woman he believed was his golden ticket, was partially dependent on my grandfather's investments to keep her business afloat. And that meant she was dependent on me. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to think rationally, to push past the sheer poetic justice of it all. Selena wasn't just some rich socialite running a vanity project. She had worked to build Blake Lux into a brand known for exclusivity and wealth. But the numbers in front of me told a different story, one she had kept well hidden from the public. Blake Lux had cash flow problems. On the surface, her company looked like a thriving empire. Glossy marketing campaigns, celebrity endorsements, lavish grand openings. But beneath that polished exterior, debt. I traced my finger over the most recent reports, my eyes narrowing. She had over-leveraged herself, expanding too fast, spending too much, relying too heavily on external funding. And a large chunk of that funding came from my family's investments. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, a slow smile curling at the edges of my lips. Ted had left me for a woman whose business I could destroy with a single phone call. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. He had no idea. The sheer irony of it made my fingers itch to act immediately, to call the lawyers, to pull the rug right out from under him before he even had a chance to settle into his new, perfect life. But I forced myself to pause. I had the power to ruin them, but power is wasted without strategy. If I wanted this to be satisfying, if I wanted Ted to truly feel the consequences of his betrayal, I needed to be smart. I needed a plan. I gathered the documents, stacking them neatly, and reached for my phone. I had spent most of my life avoiding the business world, but I wasn't naive. I knew I needed professional help, people who could guide me through this, people I could trust. And there was only one person I knew who could give me answers. James Monroe. He had been my grandfather's closest confidant, his personal attorney for over 30 years. After my grandfather's passing, James had tried to explain the inheritance to me, but at the time, I had brushed it off, uninterested in dealing with hotel finances. I regretted that now. I found his number in my contacts and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Laura, his voice was warm, but surprised. It's been a long time. Too long, I agreed. I'm sorry for calling so late, but I need to see you. Tomorrow, if possible. There was a brief pause. This is about your grandfather's estate, isn't it? I exhaled sharply. Of course he knew. Yes. I was wondering when you'd finally take an interest, James said. There was no judgment in his tone, just a quiet understanding. Come by my office at 10. I'll have everything ready for you. The next morning, James Monroe's office smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place that carried decades of secrets. He greeted me with a knowing look as he gestured for me to take a seat. I had a feeling I'd be seeing you eventually, he said, setting down a thick folder on his desk. I hesitated. You knew I'd come? James smiled. Your grandfather always said you'd figure it out when the time was right. Something in my chest tightened. I wished I had paid more attention to the things my grandfather had tried to teach me when he was alive. James slid the folder toward me. These are all the assets under your control. Hotels, investments, stock portfolios. Everything your grandfather left you. I flipped it open, scanning the pages. The numbers were staggering. How much control do I actually have? I asked. James leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. Total control. As the sole beneficiary, you have the power to make any financial decisions regarding these assets. Including, he said with a small smirk, restricting funding to certain businesses. My head snapped up. Even Blake Lux? He nodded. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my lips. Then let's get started. James Monroe leaned forward, watching me closely as I tapped my fingers against the thick folder of documents. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice measured. I met his gaze, unflinching. I'm done being the woman Ted underestimated. James chuckled, shaking his head. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said you had his instincts. I hadn't thought much about my grandfather's business acumen before now. But as I sat in James's office, looking at the legal proof of what I now controlled, I realized something. Maybe I had inherited more from him than I thought. Tell me exactly what pulling funding from Blake Lux would do, I said. James steepled his fingers. It depends on how aggressively you want to move. Selena Blake is smart, ambitious, but she's made some risky financial decisions. Expanding too fast, relying too much on investor confidence. Over-leveraged, I murmured, recalling the numbers I had studied the night before. He nodded. And if her investors get even a whiff of instability, they'll panic. A company like Blake Lux thrives on the illusion of exclusivity. The second that illusion cracks, I exhaled, already seeing it in my mind. The perfect life Ted thinks he walked into starts to fall apart. James's lips twitched into a small smile. Exactly. I ran a finger along the edge of the folder, considering my options. I could have gone for the K*LLSH*T right away, pulled every last cent, let the company spiral into chaos. But that would be too easy. Too quick. And I wanted Ted to feel this. I wanted him to watch it crumble around him, piece by piece, knowing he had no control over it. I wanted him to drown in the consequences of his own arrogance. Start restricting funding, I decided. Nothing obvious. Just enough to cause tension. I want the pressure to build. Make Selena scramble. James nodded, clearly impressed. I'll take care of it. I stood, smoothing down my coat. Oh, and James. He raised an eyebrow. Don't tell them who's behind it. Not yet. He grinned. Now, that's strategy. The first signs of trouble. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. A few weeks after I met with James, whispers started circulating in the business world. Rumors. Several high-end investors were reconsidering their stakes in Blake Lux. A few upcoming projects were suddenly delayed due to unexpected financial setbacks. Selena Blake, always poised and polished, kept up appearances, but I could tell from the way the news outlets phrased their reports that something was off. Then, the first rail hit landed. One of Blake Lux's high-profile deals, an expansion into Miami, fell through at the last minute. Investors had quietly pulled out, leaving the project stranded in limbo. And just like that, the media pounced. Sources close to Blake Lux suggest that the company may be facing unexpected liquidity issues. Has Selena Blake stretched herself too thin? And my personal favorite. Industry experts speculate, is the luxury empire not as untouchable as it seems? I sat back in my chair, sipping my coffee, watching as the headlines slowly started to tighten around them like a noose. Ted, clueless and comfortable. Through it all, Ted remained blissfully unaware. I knew this because he had started posting smug little updates on social media, pictures of himself at luxury events, tagging Selena in posts about their power couple status. As if his entire world wasn't about to collapse. I had expected a reaction when the Miami deal fell apart, but he didn't mention it once. Which told me everything I needed to know. Selena hadn't told him. Not about the delays. Not about the whispers. Not about the fact that her company's foundation was shaking beneath her feet. And why would she? Men like Ted only saw the glittering surface. They never bothered to check if the foundation beneath them was rotting. So I let him bask in his false sense of security. I let him enjoy the fancy parties and luxury vacations, still believing he had made the perfect trade. Because when the fall came, when he finally realized the truth, I wanted it to be devastating. The next phase. James and I kept the pressure steady. Another deal fell apart this time, an exclusive partnership with a European fashion house. The reason? Concerns about financial stability. Selena must have been seething. I could picture her, sitting in one of her pristine office suites, fuming as she tried to hold everything together. But the thing about holding something together is that it only works if you can trust the people around you. And if I knew Selena, and I was starting to feel like I did, she was about to start questioning Ted. Wondering if he was the dead weight pulling her down. Ted finally feels it. The first real sign that Ted was feeling the cracks came when I got a call from an old mutual friend. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Laura," Daniel said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're not going to believe what I just heard." I raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Ted's losing it. Apparently, Selena's been cutting him off from certain accounts. He tried to take some money out last week, and the card declined. I almost dropped my coffee. He had no idea. For the first time since this started, Ted was personally feeling the squeeze. I bit my lip, trying to suppress my satisfaction. How'd he take it? Daniel laughed. Not well. He tried to play it off, but you know Ted, he's used to being taken care of. I think he's realizing Selena isn't as generous as he thought. Oh, this was better than I had hoped. Ted had built his entire identity around luxury. He had never been the kind of man who could handle financial struggle. And now, for the first time, he was seeing the signs. But the best part? This was only the beginning. Ted had always been good at pretending. Even in our worst years of marriage, he could put on a dazzling smile for dinner parties, act like the devoted husband when people were watching, laugh at jokes he didn't find funny just to keep up appearances. But pretending only works when you're in control. And Ted was losing control. I saw the first real sign of it when his social media activity changed. For weeks, his Instagram had been a highlight reel of luxury, the private yacht parties, the front row seats at exclusive events, the extravagant weekend getaways. Then, suddenly, the posts stopped. No more pictures of lavish dinners. No more photos of him draped in designer suits, posing with expensive cocktails. At first, I thought maybe he was just laying low, waiting out the storm. Then, Daniel called again. "You're going to love this," he said, barely containing his laughter. "Ted showed up at the golf club last week looking like hell." I leaned forward in my chair. "How bad are we talking?" "Like, disheveled bad." Shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot *T, snapping at the staff when they didn't bring his drink fast enough. Apparently, Selena has him on a budget now. I blinked. A budget? Oh yeah. Word is, she's cutting him off from most of her accounts. Something about reassessing financial priorities. I almost choked on my tea. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. Selena was feeling the pressure. Her company was losing investor confidence, her deals were falling apart, and instead of looking inward, she was starting to turn on Ted. Because that's what people like her do. They don't take responsibility. They eliminate deadweight. And Ted? Ted was looking awfully heavy. The beginning of the end. A week after Daniel's call, I finally saw it for myself. I had gone to my usual cafe for coffee, not expecting to run into anyone, but there he was, Ted. Sitting alone at a corner table, staring at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. He looked rough. The man who once prided himself on his appearance, the tailored suits, the perfect hair, looked exhausted. His expensive watch was still on his wrist, but his clothes weren't quite as polished, his 5 o'clock shadow a little too heavy. For the first time in years, he looked ordinary. And I knew exactly why. He was starting to realize that Selena wasn't his savior. Realize that the world he had abandoned me for was crumbling beneath him. And he couldn't stop it. I took my time stirring my coffee, watching him from across the cafe. He was scrolling through his phone, refreshing something over and over. His bank account, maybe? His emails? Texts Selena hadn't responded to? I wanted to walk up to him, wanted to say something cutting, something vicious. But I didn't. Because the best revenge? Was letting him sit there. Letting him drown in it. So I sipped my coffee, smiled to myself, and walked away. Selena makes her move. A few days later, I got a text from James. It's happening. I called him immediately. She's pulling away, he said. I've been keeping an eye on her business dealings, and Selena is actively trying to shift assets out of Ted's reach. It looks like she's preparing to cut him loose. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment. She's getting rid of him. It's only a matter of time. I let out a slow breath. I had predicted this would happen. But now that it was actually unfolding, I almost wished I could be there to see it. To see the exact moment Ted realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. The collapse. I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks later, Selena officially dropped him. It started subtly, her public appearances without him, her polite but non-committal responses when interviewers asked about her relationship. Then, the final nail in the coffin. A press release from Blake Lux. It was disguised as a generic business announcement, but buried within the wording was the key detail, a realignment of priorities that conveniently did not include Ted. The media went wild. Selena Blake and Ted Morgan split, rumors confirmed. Blake Lux shakeup. Is Selena cutting ties with her partner? Sources say financial tension led to separation. Ted Morgan left out in the cold. Oh, how beautifully poetic. The same man who once bragged about leaving me for a better life had now been tossed aside like a used napkin. And the best part? He had nowhere to go. Ted tries to crawl back. The moment the split became public, I knew what was coming. And sure enough, it only took 3 days for Ted to try contacting me. At first, it was just a text. Ted, hey, can we talk? I stared at the message for a full minute before locking my phone and setting it aside. Then came the second message. Ted, Laura, please. I just need to talk to you for a second. No, he didn't. He didn't need to talk to me when he left me without a word. He didn't need to talk to me when he was spending my money on another woman. And he sure as hell didn't need to talk to me now. I ignored him again. But then, on the 4th day, he called. I let it ring. Then he called again. And again. By the 6th call, curiosity got the best of me. I picked up. The moment he heard my voice, he exhaled sharply. Laura. Thank God. I cut him off. No. He paused. No. That's right, Ted. No. A beat of silence. Then, his voice turned desperate. I need to talk to you. Can we meet? No. Laura, please. I almost laughed. Hearing him beg was more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. But I didn't let myself gloat, not yet. Because I knew, without a doubt, he wasn't done falling. Not yet. And when he finally hit rock bottom, I wanted front row seats. Ted had always been proud. Even when we were married, he hated admitting when he was wrong, even in the smallest ways. If he took a wrong turn while driving, he'd insist he meant to go that way. If he forgot an anniversary, he'd blame his busy schedule. Apologizing to him was an admission of weakness. So the fact that he was calling me, begging me to meet, told me everything I needed to know. He had nothing left. I let his last voicemail sit there unanswered for a full week. Then, finally, I decided to give him what he wanted. Or, at least, let him think he was getting what he wanted. Setting the trap. I sent him a text brief, to the point. Fine. Meet me at 6 p.m. La Shilla. La Shilla wasn't just any restaurant, it was the place where Ted had taken me for our anniversary dinner last year. The same restaurant where he spent the entire night texting someone else. At the time, I had told myself I was overthinking it. That he was just distracted. That I was being paranoid. I wasn't. And now, he'd have to sit in that same room, facing the consequences of his own selfishness. The meeting. I arrived 10 minutes late, just to make him sweat. When I walked in, I barely recognized him. Ted had always been polished, perfectly tailored suits, freshly shaved, exuding confidence even when he didn't deserve it. Now, he looked wrecked. His hair was slightly overgrown, his jaw rough with stubble. The suit he wore wasn't the high-end designer brand he used to flaunt. It was something cheaper, slightly wrinkled. And his eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked afraid. I took my time sitting down, adjusting my napkin, letting him squirm. He cleared his throat. Thanks for meeting me. I took a sip of my wine. I was curious. His fingers tapped anxiously against the table. Laura, No, I set my glass down. You don't get to start this conversation. I do. Ted shut his mouth. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice calm, steady. You left me for another woman. Not just any woman, but Selena Blake. You did it so publicly that everyone in our lives knew about it before I did. And you didn't even have the decency to face me. You left a letter. His jaw clenched. I held up a hand. I'm not finished. He swallowed. I took another slow sip of my wine before continuing. You didn't just leave, Ted. You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was nothing. Like I was replaceable. I saw his throat tighten. And now, I said, my voice turning colder, you're here. Sitting across from me. After everything. So tell me, Ted, why? He exhaled sharply, looking away for a moment before running a hand through his hair. I made a mistake, he admitted, voice raw. Selena, she's not who I thought she was. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. He laughed bitterly. At first, it was perfect. Everything I wanted. She treated me like a king, bought me things, took me to places I never could have afforded on my own. It was easy. I said nothing. His voice dropped lower. But then, things changed. She started pulling back. The money wasn't as free-flowing. She got colder, more distant. And then, one day, he swallowed hard. She cut me off. Completely. She told me I wasn't her priority anymore. I tilted my head. And you're surprised? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Regret. I was an idiot, he said, barely above a whisper. I thought I was trading up. He shook his head. I don't know what I thought. I let the silence stretch, watching him sit there in his own failure. Finally, he sighed. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I need help. There it was. The real reason he had asked to meet. Not because he wanted closure. Not because he was truly sorry. But because he needed something. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Help with what, exactly? His jaw tightened, and he hesitated, like it physically hurt him to say it. I don't have anywhere else to go. I almost laughed. Ted, the same man who once told me he would never need a woman for anything, was now sitting across from me, asking for my help. It was delicious. But I wasn't done yet. I leaned forward, keeping my voice cool. You said I wasn't good enough for you, Ted. His face paled. You told me Selena was everything I wasn't. That she was sophisticated, ambitious, the kind of woman who could actually support a man. He winced. And now, I continued, you're sitting here, broke, alone, asking me for help. He swallowed hard. I know I don't deserve it. But, Laura, we were married for 15 years. That has to count for something. I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. Then I gave him the final blow. You're right, Ted, I said softly. It does count for something. Hope flickered in his eyes. Then I smiled. That's why I'm not going to help you. His face crumbled. I stood, smoothing out my dress. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Ted. And then I walked out, leaving him sitting there, alone, exactly how he left me. I stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air, my heels clicking against the pavement as I made my way to my car. The city buzzed around me, bright lights, laughter from sidewalk cafes, the hum of traffic. It was the same world I had lived in for years. And yet, everything felt different. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. No more resentment weighing me down. No more bitterness gnawing at the edges of my heart. Ted had spent years making me feel small, unimportant, replaceable. But as I walked away from him for the last time, I realized something. I had never been the small one. He had. He was the one who had needed me, who had depended on me, who had spent his whole life trying to attach himself to someone more powerful, more successful, more put together. And when he thought he had found better, he crumbled. Without someone to prop him up, he had nothing. I had always been the strong one. I just hadn't realized it until now. Ted's final attempt. The next morning, I woke up to one last text from Ted. Ted, Laura, please. I don't know what else to do. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. No reply. No closure. Nothing, because he didn't deserve it. I had wasted enough of my life waiting for Ted to see my worth. I wasn't going to waste another second. Taking control. Over the next few months, I dove headfirst into my new life. I took an active role in managing my inheritance, working closely with James to restructure my grandfather's holdings. For the first time, I wasn't just signing papers and trusting other people to handle things. I was in control. And I was good at it. The more I learned, the more I realized how much power I had. Hotels, real estate, investments. Things I had once brushed aside as too complicated were now mine to command. James noticed the shift in me. One afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting, he smiled and shook his head. You know, he said, when I first met you, I thought you'd never take an interest in this world. I smirked. Neither did Ted. James chuckled. Well, look at you now. Look at me now. The fall of Blake Lux. And as for Selena? Her downfall was even sweeter than I had imagined. Without the financial support from my family's holdings, her empire slowly but surely crumbled. Investors lost confidence. Deals fell apart. And eventually, Blake Lux was forced to sell off several key properties just to stay afloat. Properties that, through a series of well-timed acquisitions, were quietly bought under my name. The first time Selena saw me at a high-profile industry event, standing next to some of the most powerful hotel moguls in the country, she went pale. She didn't speak to me. She didn't have to. She knew. She knew exactly who had pulled the strings that led to her downfall. And the best part? I never had to say a word. A year later. It took exactly 1 year for everything to come full circle. 1 year since Ted had walked out of our marriage, thinking he was walking into a better life. 1 year since he had looked at me like I was nothing. Now? I was standing in the lobby of my newest luxury hotel, one of the very properties that had once belonged to Blake Lux. I wore a perfectly tailored dress, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I moved through the space. I had just finished a meeting with a team of investors when I saw him. Ted. He didn't see me at first. He was standing near the reception desk, looking lost. He had aged in the last year. There was something hollow in his face, a man who had spent too long chasing a life that no longer wanted him. Then, as I turned, his gaze landed on me. For a moment, he just stared, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then, slowly, he walked toward me. Laura, he breathed. I met his gaze evenly. Ted. He swallowed, his throat bobbing. This place, this is yours? I smiled. One of many. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus. I waited. I already knew what was coming. He hesitated, his voice rough. I was an idiot. I raised an eyebrow. You were. He let out a broken laugh. You don't even deny it. I shrugged. Why should I? He shook his head. I miss you, Laura. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with the same cold indifference he once showed me, I delivered my final words to him. I don't miss you. I saw the moment the truth hit him. His expression shattered, his shoulders slumping, the last bit of pride he had crumbling to dust. I gave him one last look. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away.